is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
On the evening of September 28, 2000, David Camm was on his way home from playing basketball with a group of his friends. By the time he entered the garage of the family home, he knew that something was wrong. Really wrong. His wife, Kim, was unresponsive on the garage floor in a pool of her own blood. She had been shot in the head, and immediately David knew that she was dead. Next to Kim's body, the passenger door of the family truck was open. David searched the vehicle frantically for their two children, 7-year-old Brad and 5-year-old Jill. He didn't have to look for long. Jill was in the back seat of the truck, her seatbelt still tightly buckled. Just like her mother, she had been fatally shot in the head. Brad was lying motionless, leaning against the back of the driver's seat, as if he had been trying to escape from the attacker. David realized that his son's skin was still warm to the touch, despite the bullet wound in his chest. Hoping that he could at least save one of his family members, David dragged Brad out of the car and laid him on the garage floor, then attempted CPR. At that time, he had no way of knowing that the bullet had passed through Brad's chest, severing his spinal cord. After several minutes, he gave up and called the police. David Camm knew the police well. He'd actually worked as a state trooper until a few months before this day, when he'd retired to work for his family's business instead. It was why, in his state of panic, that he completely bypassed 911 and called on his former coworkers. "Get everybody out to my house now," he screamed in the phone. "My wife and kids are dead." In his grief, David never stopped to consider the thought that his old colleagues might not be his allies. He didn't consider the first theory that the police would want to look into. If only one person survives a family annihilation, they are almost always the killer. The evidence stacked up against him. Forensic testing of his clothes revealed that his shirt was spotted with his daughter Jill's blood. During Jill's autopsy, signs of trauma were found on her genitals. The medical examiner said that there were two possible explanations. Either Jill had recently fallen onto something which had caused bruising to her genital area, or she had been sexually assaulted. David's mother-in-law, Janice, was sure that Jill would have told somebody if she was being molested, unless the person molesting her was her own father. Investigators were also suspicious about how David behaved after finding the bodies. They thought it was strange that he'd called his old co-workers instead of dialing 911. And despite David's explanations, they couldn't understand why he had left Jill and Kim's bodies where he found them, but he tried to revive his son with CPR. Then, bombshell. When they discovered that David had been cheating on Kim with multiple women, it just added even more fuel to the fire. That following Sunday, the police asked David to come in for further questioning. When he got there, he never left the station. Shortly after his arrival, he was arrested and charged with first-degree murders of Kim, Brad, and Jill. He wasn't allowed to attend the funeral, but the police permitted him to view the bodies of his family. During the 5-minute-long viewing, he was supervised by 15 officers and kept in handcuffs. By the time David's trial began, members of his family were being threatened by members of the public who were convinced that he was guilty. Somebody found his brother's phone number and left a message saying, quote, "If your brother gets out of jail, I've got a bullet for you. A bullet for your uncle, a bullet for your attorney, and a bullet for him." All 11 people who David played basketball with the day of the murders testified at the trial. Each of them insisted that David had been his normal self that night. They had not noticed any bloodstains on his clothes, and they were certain that he had not snuck away from the basketball court at any point. Several women who David had slept with also testified about the affairs they had with him. Affairs that the state argued were the motive for the killings. David decided to take the stand and testify himself, but the evidence was stacked against him. At the conclusion of the trial, he was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to almost 200 years in prison. He appealed the sentence, and the Indiana Supreme Court ended up agreeing with his argument. The only thing the state had proven is that he was a terrible husband that had been unfaithful to his wife. The charges were filed against David again, and the county prosecutor made an announcement. He planned to reinvestigate the case with fresh eyes. David's own family, who still believed he was innocent, were relieved. While reinvestigating the case, officers discovered one thing that evidence technicians had failed to test. A sweatshirt had been found underneath Brad's body, and it didn't belong to any of the Camm family members. In fact, they had never seen it before that night because it was a Department of Corrections sweatshirt. It contained the DNA of an unknown man, which had not been analyzed before the trial. Now, how do you miss something like this unless you already had your mind made up who the killer was? It's almost as if they investigated not to find evidence of who killed David Camm's family, but to find evidence to support their thought that David was the one that annihilated his own family. The DNA and the sweatshirt belonged to a felon named Charles Boney, who had been nicknamed the Shoe Bandit for his habit of taking shoes of the women that he assaulted. It matched a strange detail about the scene of the Camm family murders. Kim's shoes had been taken off of her feet and placed on top of the truck. The word backbone was written on the inside of the sweatshirt's collar. It was what Charles Boney's fellow convicts had called him during his time in prison. After serving his 11-year sentence, Charles had been released less than a year before the Camm family was killed. An unknown handprint on the side of the truck also matched Charles, placing him at the scene of the crime. When Charles was questioned about the case, he tried to insist that he had never in his life met the Camms. After realizing that he had left both a piece of clothing and a handprint at the scene of the crime, he tried a different tactic. This time, he gave a statement about how he'd met David several months beforehand, because David asked Charles to buy him a gun. Shortly afterwards, David asked for a second gun. Then the two men had met at the Camm family home shortly before the murders took place. Charles said he handed over the gun, which he had wrapped in his own sweatshirt, and shortly afterwards, he heard the sound of David shooting Kim, Brad, and Jill. It wasn't the exoneration that David and his family had hoped for. Now, David was still being charged with the murders, but so was Charles. In their simultaneous trials, Charles, the Shoe Bandit, was found guilty and received a 225-year prison sentence. Meanwhile, the prosecution are now arguing that David hadn't killed his family because of infidelity. He killed them because his wife found out that he was molesting his daughter. For the second time, David was found guilty, but the verdict was overturned due to lack of proof that David molested his daughter. David's third trial began in August of 2013. This time, the state wanted it to be final, so the judge forbade anybody from testifying about either Jill's supposed molestation or David's infidelity. Instead, the prosecution focused on the 8 spots of Jill's blood that had been found on David's shirt. Charles Boney testified, giving the same story about how he'd handed David the gun, and then David had turned and shot each of his family members one by one. He added that after the murders, David had come out of the garage and tried to shoot him as well. This time, the jury only took 10 hours to reach their decision. After 3 trials and 13 years, David Camm was found not guilty of murdering his family. He wore his wedding ring for a month after his release, and then finally removed it for good. Eventually, David was employed as a caseworker for a nonprofit organization that advocates for people who have been wrongly convicted of a crime. In 2022, the state of Indiana paid out a $4.6 million settlement in response to David's claims that he had been maliciously prosecuted and wrongfully imprisoned. David's family and the state of Indiana have agreed that he is innocent of the murder charges, but Kim's family have never changed their minds. To this day, they believe that he was the killer and that the man who murdered Kim, Brad, and Jill is now walking free. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe. That's my name. I'm the host, and thank you so much for listening. And I know what you're thinking already. This episode seems a little different. It sounds a little bit different, and yeah, it does. The reason is I got a new mouse pad. I spilled a drink on the other one, and it got sticky. It was a soda, so I replaced it. Now all good. It didn't affect the sound. I'm just making that part up. But I did get a new mouse pad. And I am also, if it pleases the court, cutting back on soda. I've been mixing in a lot more water into what I'm drinking. I'm told that helps to make you feel better, look better, and be better. The jury is still out on that one, but I'm happy to give it a try. And hey, if you're brand new to listening to 10-Minute Murder, maybe this is your first or second episode, welcome. Please hit subscribe wherever you're listening right now, and know that if you're listening on YouTube, not all the episodes are there. Some of them are there. Most of them are there, but not all of them. We're approaching 400 now, I think. That could be a made-up number, but I think that's about where we are, getting closer to 400 episodes. And every one of them are going to be on podcast listening apps like Apple, Spotify, and even Audible. You can listen to them on Audible. And incidentally, those places, you can also leave positive feedback if you'd like. Positive feedback helps this show grow, so leave a rating and review on any of those platforms, anyone that it's possible, honestly. Anyway, I feel like I'm talking in circles now. That's the end of the episode. Thank you so much for listening to 10-Minute Murder. Goodbye.